Well, it's possible because as long as they're able to hold on to their wealth, that means that we have instant access to it. If they put it in the bank, that means banks don't just take in deposits to stare lovingly at Mick Jagger or Paris Hilton's wealth. They immediately lend it out to people who want to start up a business or need a loan to buy a house or to go to college. And so when the rich hold on to their wealth, we all have access to it. And so that's true today. They could also invest it in the stock market, which means they're providing their capital to the companies of today. They could also put it into private equity or venture capital funds and provide investment for the companies of the future. Any way you look at it, when the rich get to keep their wealth, everyone gets to enjoy it and prosper. So if they do, banks again don't just stare at it. They're paying for that deposit, which means they're going to lend it out to people like all of us who need money to, again, start up a business or need it to maybe for a college loan or maybe we need a car. But any way you look at it, when the rich get to keep their wealth, we all have instant access. No, there's no such thing in my mind as a bubble. Let's face it, there's always a buyer and seller. So the passions of the buyers are always counteracted by the skepticism of the sellers. And so I don't buy the bubble argument. I think there are times when the U.S. Treasury mishandles the dollar on the way to malinvestment that led to that, but I think you've got to separate the two. Savings could never cause a quote bubble, which I reject as a notion in the first place. If there were a domino effect, Silicon Valley would be the poorest region in all of the world, because let's face it, just about every business in Silicon Valley fails, and it fails massively. But in fact, failure is the source of economic evolution. Imagine if Ben Affleck kept having his bad ideas propped up. Imagine if he'd never been allowed to fail. He wouldn't be an Academy Award winning director. The Fed's theoretical role began as a lender of last resort. Banks that were fully capitalized, that were short on cash in the very near term, they could go to the Fed and pledge their assets, as in their loans, as collateral to get cash. But as we see in the market economy, no solvent bank would ever approach the Fed for a loan. It just doesn't happen. Why would you go to the Fed when there are countless market sources that would provide that same loan to you, that wouldn't put you basically on the hook to a government that does not care about profits? And so no one ever goes to the Fed. It's an admission that the free markets have chosen not to lend to you. It serves no useful purpose. It can't be what it began as a lender of last resort. Any banker will tell you that if you're solvent, it's unheard of to go to the Fed for a loan. Is it a good regulator of banks? Well, the Fed's bailed out Citigroup 5 times in 25 years by its own admission. So it's certainly not a good regulator of banks. It doesn't keep them healthy. Some say it should set interest rates. Well, it can't. I mean, interest rates are priced like any other. It involves the infinite decisions of savers and borrowers. The Fed can't credibly set that. Can the Fed increase credit in the economy? Well, it cannot do that. Not only is credit rejected by economies that are not thriving, but the greater truth is that the Fed has no credit to increase. It can only increase the credit that it took from us in the first place. The Fed began with it as a lender of last resort. The idea was that banks in New York were having their clocks cleaned by outside non-bank sources of lending, and then non-New York banks. And so the idea was, let's provide the money-centered banks with a backup. But as we've seen in modern times, the Fed cannot be that backup. Why do most governmental programs still exist? It's written about in the book once, and this is the problem with government revenues in general, is that once a program begins, it's very hard to stop. The Fed employs 20,000 plus economists, and so there is a very big and very highly educated constituency behind the idea that we need a Fed. But would we notice it if it disappeared tomorrow? I don't think we would. It's thought that they do, but they don't. Think about in the economy we live in. If you look at all the billionaire venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. That's a signal that the Fed doesn't really control interest rates, because if you want to start up a business in Silicon Valley, credit is so expensive that you're going to give up a big portion of it to a VC, and even more of it to potential employees in the form of stock options. If you want to make a movie today in Hollywood, even if you're at the top, Brian Grazer, A Beautiful Mind, Splash, Arrested Development, good. If you've got one of the best track records in Hollywood, you're going to be turned down for credit 90% of the time. Let's look at, by Grazer's own admission, let's look at Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States. At his height as a real estate mogul, which was the late 80s, as early as 1990, he was viewed as a major credit risk. It was difficult for him to get a loan. As I describe in my book, he went out to Los Angeles seeking a loan from Security Pacific Bank, then the fifth largest U.S. bank, $50 million to revitalize a hotel in Los Angeles. He had all these assets that said, I'm good for the loan. They did not believe him. They loaned him $10 million. They wrote it down 2 years later. He didn't pay back a dime. But the point is, the Fed decrees easy credit with zero interest rates over here, but in the real economy, we act as though the Fed doesn't exist. He didn't pay it back because he didn't have the money, and so they ultimately wrote down the loan. The CEO of the bank expressed, and I describe in the book, I did not want to deal with him at all. But the feeling was he is a celebrity, he's well known, probably doesn't hurt our brand to be associated with such a big name. And so they loaned him $10 million on the assumption that probably he would want to pay it back just to keep his good name intact. He walked away from it. Great question. I was working at Goldman Sachs in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they're talking about what will the Fed do next. And the assumption was if the unemployment rate falls as if the economy's growing, that this will lead to inflation. And I said, wait a second. I grew up in the 1970s. I know what inflation is. This is a valuation of the dollar. It has nothing to do with the Fed. It's a U.S. Treasury function. Treasury and the president generally get the dollar they want. Economic growth doesn't cause inflation. And I said, if this is what the pundits believe, and this is what economists believe, I've got to get into this because I can disprove that theory that growth causes inflation in a heartbeat. And in fact, in both books, Popular Economics and Who Needs the Fed, I address the Fed's view that economic growth is the source of rising prices and reveal it as the exact opposite. Economic growth is the biggest driver of falling prices that mankind has ever conceived. And so that's why I got into it. I couldn't believe what economists and pundits believed. It's a very good question. Certainly with Popular Economics, it did reach a lot of important people. We'll see with this one. I'm hoping that it reaches them. I've certainly contacted people I know who have either been at the Fed or who are with it now just to say it's not helping you that people hate you for the wrong reasons. It's not helping you that you're viewed as being capable of creating economic growth when you plainly can't. Let's get the real story out there. So I'd like to think that a book that simplifies things, that makes people realize that the Fed really isn't as dangerous as it's thought to be, but it's also not nearly as powerful as it is, that it's basically shrinking before our eyes. I think that's healthy for all concerned. Alan Greenspan wrote a very interesting memoir. Alan Greenspan used to, I think, believe much of what I believe here. I think, sadly, as the Fed chairman, he fell in love with his press. And if you look from the day that Maestro by Bob Woodward was published, and you look at how the economy performed and the stock market performed, it was apparent that Alan Greenspan went from being someone who said let market signals kind of rule what the Fed does, which was healthy, to becoming the person who said the Fed should actually create and engineer economic growth. The differences are vast. He fell in love with his press, and I think it was a disaster for him. David Stockman has been predicting the decline of the United States for at least the last 35 years. He's been persistently wrong. I like David Stockman. We've emailed. I like that he's skeptical about government spending, but when you consider the deficits that have him believing that that's the source of all of our economic ills, government can either tax away the money, which means it gets it, just means it gets it. We owe government money in taxes, or it can borrow it. You want to ask me, would I prefer a balanced budget of $3.5 trillion a year or annual deficits of $1 trillion on $1.1 trillion in spending? I'll take those deficits any day of the week because that's the big burden on the economy. It's the government spending. David Stockman's a smart man who's gotten a lot wrong, and the biggest thing is he keeps betting against the United States. Taylor Swift will entertain you. What she'll teach you in the book is that if you want to please your customers, you must please those providing the service first. Taylor Swift told Apple Music when it decided to offer its streaming music service for free for 3 months, she said, that's fine, you can do that, but you won't have my music to stream. That's what the Fed doesn't acknowledge. If you accept that the Fed should exist, you must then say that the Fed's models are backwards. They act as though the savers don't matter in the borrowing equation. But if you love borrowing, you must love saving. The Fed acts with its zero rates as though savers don't count. And I think Taylor Swift and businesses like Uber that recognize the driver, that recognize the creator of the music, expose the Fed's 20,000 economists as lacking clothes.